Hi guys. Tonight we gather not merely to listen, but to travel. You and I, yes. You, stretched upon your bed, perhaps with the blue glow of your phone or the dim flicker of a night lamp about to step into a road that once linked worlds. It was called the Silk Road, though silks were only one thread in its vast, tangled weave. It carried jade and glass, prayers and curses, poems and rumors. It carried emperors' dreams and bandits' knives. And it carried the beating hearts of empires now so forgotten that even their ruins lie swallowed by sand, like bones hidden beneath the skin of a desert. Before we set foot on this road, I must warn you, the Silk Road does not promise safety. Its lanterns flicker against the dark, but the shadows it casts are long. Caravans have vanished without trace. Cities have bloomed like wildflowers only to wither in a single season, and kings have ruled entire valleys whose names you will never find on a modern map, and you, if you had walked there, might not have survived a week. The cold of the high passes alone could snap your bones like twigs. But tonight, comfortably under your blankets, you will. That's the perk of bedtime history, a deadly journey transformed into a story you can drift to sleep with. So, before we go further, I invite you gently, like the tug of a camel's reins, to support this wandering storyteller. Click like, subscribe to Tales by the Flame, and know that every click helps fuel the next journey. Share the firelight, and while you're here, drop a note in the comments. Where are you listening from? Is it the middle of the night in Hanoi? Is it dawn in London? Are you hiding in your office pretending to work in New York? Let us weave a community as wide as the Silk Road itself, a chain of lanterns glowing across the world map. And now our path is set. Picture the desert at night. The horizon is not a line, but an illusion, blurred into sky. The stars are harsh and sharp, scattered like diamonds flung by a careless hand. Beneath them moves a caravan, small yellow lights swaying as lanterns swing from the saddles of camels. Their breath clouds the air, white against black. Somewhere in those shadows lies you, perched on a creaking saddle, the smell of wool and leather pressed against your face, your ears filled with the groan of shifting packs and the low humming songs of drivers. But if you listen closely, beyond the hoofbeats and the sigh of the sand, you hear something else. Stories. Stories that pass between riders to keep them awake. Stories that carry warnings. Stories that whisper of cities to wonders to believe and of kingdoms that ruled the desert only to vanish in silence. And that is the riddle of the Silk Road. Its empires rose with brilliance and fell with scarcely a trace. Rome and China, you know. Byzantium and Persia, perhaps. But Sogdia, Loulan, Khwarezm, the Kushan, the Uyghurs, they are barely footnotes, if they are mentioned at all. How can an empire with armies, palaces, and wealth enough to shape the world simply slip away? And yet they did. Some say the sand swallowed them, others say their bloodline trickled into new peoples, their names worn away like paint on old silk. I like to imagine their ghosts still ride at night, their lanterns bobbing just beyond our sight. And if you think this fanciful, remember, the Silk Road itself has always been half legend, half fact. It is a place where a historical chronicle can turn into a folk tale simply because someone told it at a campfire in the dark. Tonight, we will not follow the emperors whose names glow in textbooks. No, we will follow the dimmer lanterns, forgotten empires, vanished kings, queens whose palaces crumbled into dust, traitors who built nations without thrones. Folk tales told in whispers and controversies historians still gnaw like stubborn bones. And so welcome, the lanterns are lit, the camels are restless, the desert stretches before us. Together, we step into the first forgotten empire, one whose merchants wielded words sharper than swords, and whose cities shone like jewels strung along the salt deserts of Central Asia. Do not lag behind, traveler. The sands are cold, and our story has just begun. The fire flickers lower, the desert wind whistles, and before you looms the first forgotten empire of our journey, Sogdia. No crown of gold, no imperial throne, no conquering army. And yet, for centuries, Sogdians ruled the Silk Road as surely as any emperor. Imagine the salt deserts of Central Asia white as bone, shimmering under a sun that makes even camels squint. Out here, kingdoms rose not from fertile fields, but from crossroads. And the Sogdians were masters of crossroads. Their cities Samarkand, Bukhara, Panjikent were not vast capitals, but glittering oases strung like beads along caravan trails. To pass through the desert, you needed water. To find water, you needed Sogdian maps, Sogdian guides, Sogdian goodwill. Without them, your caravan might vanish like a mirage. They were not warriors, but merchants, and yet, they fought battles stranger and sharper than sword fights battles of language. A Sogdian child was expected to speak not one tongue, but many. Sogdian at home, Persian with neighbors, Chinese with emissaries, Sanskrit with monks, Greek with philosophers, Turkic with nomads, Arabic with travelers, and maybe a few Mongolic words tossed in for good measure. If you stumbled upon a Sogdian merchant, you could never be sure what language he would greet you in. He might switch tongues mid-sentence, the way a juggler tosses knives in the air. And that, my friend, is how you build an empire without borders, by speaking into every ear that matters. Their caravans stretched for miles, camels swaying beneath bolts of Chinese silk, Roman glass, Persian silver, Indian spices, and Byzantine wine. But here's the twist: the Sogdians rarely consumed the goods themselves. They were middlemen, empire brokers, the lubricators of trade. Their power was invisible, but it was everywhere. Without them, the Silk Road would have been not a highway but a series of dead ends. Even emperors bent to them. A Chinese court might declare, "We forbid foreign trade." But then, weeks later, silk would still arrive in Samarkand, carried by Sogdian hands. A Persian Shah might levy taxes, and Sogdian accountants would quietly rewrite the ledgers. They didn't conquer, they persuaded. They didn't plunder, they bartered. Some say the Sogdians could talk a stone into giving them water. Their art reflected this cosmopolitan genius. In Panjikent, archaeologists have found murals that look like a Silk Road fever dream. Chinese dragons twined with Greek heroes, Indian elephants parading beside Persian gods, a whirlpool of cultures dancing across plaster walls. Imagine standing in a dimly lit hall, oil lamps flickering. As you gaze upon Hercules painted next to the Hindu goddess Durga, it was a place where identities blurred, where the world seemed stitched together by brushstrokes. And yet here's the irony: while the Sogdians stitched together the world, their own empire never fully solidified. They were always someone else's subjects: Persians, Turks, Arabs, Mongols. Their cities shone, but their armies were borrowed. Their power was economic, cultural, whispered. When the Mongols thundered across Central Asia centuries later, Samarkand would be destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again. And the Sogdian name, once spoken across continents, faded like ink left out in the sun. Still, echoes remain. If you sip sweet wine in Samarkand today, or listen to a folk song sung in Tajikistan, there is a shadow of Sogdia in it. A shadow of merchants who once ruled by words, not swords. But history has teeth, and Sogdia, for all its brilliance, would soon find itself overshadowed literally by the sands. For just east of their shining cities lay another empire, one so fragile, it seemed built not of stone but of dust. Its name was Loulan, and it vanished so completely that some believe the desert itself swallowed it whole. The lanterns flicker, and the desert wind sharpens. Our caravan crests a dune, and suddenly there it is, or rather, there it was, Loulan. Picture a kingdom stitched out of thirst. Loulan sat on the edge of the Tarim Basin, near the shifting Lop Nor Lake. To the north stretched endless desert, to the south the Kunlun Mountains, and around Loulan itself nothing but wind. Yet for centuries, this brittle land pulsed with life. Loulan was no sprawling capital like Chang'an. It was more like a jewel pressed into a crown, small, bright, and oddly fragile. The Chinese called it Krorena. To Persians, it was just another name on the map. But to caravans, Loulan was a lifeline. Travelers staggering out of the desert found here water, shelter, and rest for blistered feet. Loulan levied taxes on every caravan that passed, and with those taxes it fed itself, turning salt and dust into gold. Kings built palaces of timber hauled in from distant valleys, their columns painted with curling motifs of dragons and suns. Envoys from Han China and the Kushan Empire both crossed Loulan's gates, bearing silks, horses, scrolls, and coins. For a fleeting moment, this kingdom at the edge of nowhere became the center of everywhere. And yet, when archaeologists rediscovered Loulan in the late 19th century, it was not a city they found, but a graveyard. Corpses lay in the sand, mummified by dry wines. Their faces were eerie in their clarity. Lips sealed by time, eyes still open, staring upward as if waiting for something. Some of the dead were wrapped in wool cloaks dyed deep crimson, their shoes decorated with geometric designs. One woman, known today as the Loulan Beauty, was buried with a feather tucked into her cap, her hair still auburn after thousands of years. She looked less like a mummy and more like someone who had fallen asleep mid-journey. How does a kingdom drown in sand? The answer lies in water, or rather, the lack of it. The Tarim River shifted course, betraying Loulan. Without its streams, the city starved. The lake it depended on dried up into a salty pan, unfit for crops or cattle. By the 4th century CE, Loulan was gone. Its palaces crumbled, its people scattered, its name fading into whispers. Only the dead remained, staring through the centuries with unblinking eyes. But Loulan's disappearance is not just a tragedy, it is a haunting. Imagine you are a merchant riding through the desert at night. The sand swirls, the stars are sharp. You glance sideways and, for a heartbeat, see the outline of wooden beams rising against the moonlight, the flicker of a torch, the faint cry of a lute. Loulan, they say, sometimes reappears in Echo City, shimmering like a mirage. Those who chase it never return. The Chinese chronicles record Loulan as a client kingdom of the Han, caught in the tug-of-war between empires. But what the chronicles do not tell, the quiet horror of walking through a city that was once alive and finding only silence. The Sogdians told stories of Loulan as a warning. Prosperity can vanish overnight, sand is patient, and empires are not. And here lies the mystery. Loulan's people left corpses with open eyes. Was it deliberate, some ritual to keep watch over eternity? Or was it chance, the dry wine simply halting decomposition mid-expression? Historians argue. Superstitious travelers whisper that Loulan's dead are still guarding something beneath the dune's treasures, perhaps, or secrets that should remain buried. The shadow of Loulan is long, even now. In modern Xinjiang, the desert reclaims villages overnight, swallowing them in dust storms. The fate of Loulan is not so distant after all. It is a reminder that nature, not kings, writes the final line of history. And yet, not all stories here are graves. Some rise from the wind like laughter. For as caravans crossed these deserts, they carried not just goods and grief, but tales strange, shimmering folk tales that gave meaning to survival. And one of these stories still flutters in the wind, the tale of the wine bride, who could lead lost travelers to safety or into ruin. The desert, for all its silence, was never empty. The Sogdians, the Loulan people, and every caravaner who dared cross the Taklamakan carried with them not only water skins and bolts of cloth, but also a treasury of tales. Among these, whispered in the hush of night when the wind screamed aloud for sleep, was the story of the wine bride. It begins, as all good desert tales do, with a caravan lost. The dunes shifted like waves, erasing every landmark. Sandstorms howled so fiercely that even the camels groaned like wounded men. Traders clutched their robes tight, praying to whatever gods would listen. And then, just when all seemed lost, she appeared, a figure in white, riding the wind itself. Her veil streamed behind her like a banner of silk, her eyes glimmering like pools of water under moonlight. She was no ordinary woman. Some said she was the daughter of a storm spirit, others that she was the ghost of a Loulan queen, still searching for her vanished city. The caravan master, blinded by grit, swore that her footsteps never touched the sand. She beckoned, no words, only a gesture, a soft raising of her hand. If the caravan followed, she would lead them. Sometimes, the stories say, she guided them safely to an oasis, where palms bent over cool water. Survivors would swear their lives to her, building small shrines at caravanserais in her honor, hanging amulets of woven reeds to call her again. But the wine bride was no tame spirit. Other tales claim she was fickle, or worse, vengeful. Some caravans that followed her disappeared forever. Their bones and goods lie beneath the dunes still, guardians of hidden cities no one should enter. A tale from Kashgar warns, if the wine bride's veil trails eastward, she will save you. If it trails westward, she will doom you. Only the keenest eyes could tell the difference in a storm. Children along the Silk Road grew up hearing this story. When the wines rattled shutters at night, mothers told them, "Hush, that is the wine bride passing by. Do not whistle, or she will hear you and mistake your breath for a call." Caravan guides, grizzled and weather-beaten, muttered that the desert itself had a bride, and she chose who would live and who would vanish. And here's the curious thing. Historians, in their sensible hats, often scoff at this. They say it was simply the way nomads explained the randomness of sandstorms, the chance of stumbling upon an oasis, or the sudden uncovering of ruins after a gale. Yet even now, in desert villages of Xinjiang, old shepherds will swear they've seen her veil ripple across the dunes. Whether ghost, goddess, or trick of wind and light, the wine bride became a part of the Silk Road's heartbeat. She was a reminder that survival here was never guaranteed, and that the desert was both a giver and a thief. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was real in her own way. After all, didn't the Sogdians, the Loulan, the Kushans all vanish into the sands? Maybe the wine bride was not just leading caravans. Maybe she was leading empires themselves, guiding them to their hidden graves beneath the dunes. The fire crackles lower. A camel sighs in its sleep. And we turn now from legend to fact, from the wine bride's spectral veil to the solid stone and living breath of a crossroads empire where cultures collided and something entirely new was born, the Kushan realm. Shift your gaze from the shifting dunes of Loulan to the fertile valleys of Bactria, where the Oxus River runs silver under the sun. Here, in the first centuries of our era, an empire emerged that was less a single kingdom than a living collage, the Kushans. The Kushans were born of nomads, the Uezi, who swept westward out of the steppes. They were horsemen hardened by wine and war, but once they settled in Bactria, they became something stranger. Instead of simply conquering, they absorbed. Instead of imposing, they blended. Imagine an empire where the royal mint struck coins stamped with Greek letters, Indian gods, and Persian fire altars all at once. Where kings were Central Asian furs, but patronized Buddhist monasteries. Where the streets echoed with a dozen languages and no one thought that odd. That was Kushan. Their great king, Kanishka I, ruled around the 2nd century CE. If Rome had its Augustus, China its Han Wudi, the Kushans had Kanishka. His empire stretched from the Hindu Kush Mountains into northern India, controlling crucial arteries of the Silk Road. But his power wasn't just territorial. Kanishka made a choice that would ripple for centuries. He embraced Buddhism. Now, don't picture the calm, golden Buddhas you've seen in temples today. Kushan Buddhism was wild, hybrid, experimental. Under Kanishka, Buddhist councils gathered to debate doctrine, and monasteries sprouted along caravan trails like lanterns against the dark. The faith spread not only through sermons, but through art that carried the fingerprints of every culture the Kushans touched. Walk into a Kushan temple and you might see something astonishing. The Buddha sculpted not in the slender, stylized Indian style, but in the muscular realism of Greece. Broad-shouldered, robed like a Roman senator, his hair curled like Apollo's. This was Greco-Buddhism, born from Greek artisans left behind by Alexander the Great's conquest centuries earlier, now working for Buddhist patrons. A traveler from Antioch might have blinked in recognition. By Zeus, that monk looks like a philosopher from home. Meanwhile, Persian fire temples burned beside Buddhist stupas. Indian deities adorned coins alongside Hellenistic ones. And riding through the streets, armored Kushan horsemen thundered with the same confidence the nomads they once were, now guarding caravans instead of raiding them. The Kushans did not just open roads, they turned roads into rivers of faith, art, and exchange. Chinese monks traveled west through Kushan lands, carrying scriptures. Indian philosophers journeyed eastward. Traders from Rome, clutching amphorae of wine and glassware, found themselves debating Sanskrit with Kushan officials. Imagine the evenings in Bactria's markets, Greek sculptors arguing about marble weights with Indian jewelers, while Persian horse traders haggled over camels with Chinese envoys, a cacophony. Yes, but a fertile one. And here lies the importance. It was through Kushan lands that Buddhism truly flowed east, carried into China, Korea, and eventually Japan. Without Kushan crossroads, the map of Asian spirituality would look entirely different. Every time you see a golden-robed Buddha statue in East Asia, remember that somewhere, a Kushan caravan once jolted along the Silk Road with scrolls, relics, and monks perched uncomfortably on camel humps. But for all their blending brilliance, the Kushans, like Sogdia and Loulan, did not last. By the 4th century, they fractured under pressure from new powers: the Sasanians from Persia, the Guptas from India, the Huns from the steppes. Their empire crumbled, their coins stopped striking, their murals faded. Still, their legacy endures not in dusty ruins, but in ideas, in the way art, religion, and culture can leap borders when carried by restless human hands. If the Silk Road was a necklace, the Kushans were the clasp that held it together, however briefly. But not all Silk Road empires were sustained by such luminous hybridity. Some were held together by fragile alliances and the wiles of individuals, sometimes just one woman with a silk veil and a keen sense of diplomacy. And that is where we ride next, into the halls of the Uyghur court, where a princess turned cloth into peace. Our caravan moves on, northward into the steppes where grass rolls like an endless green sea. Here rose the Uyghur Khaganate, an empire of horsemen, swift and fierce, who in the 8th century controlled a vast stretch of Central Asia. To most outsiders, they were terrifying. Riders with eagle eyes, arrows that seemed to find their target before the bowstring snapped, and horses so quick that Chinese poets called them wine drinkers. Yet even in such a world of warriors, it was not always iron that held power. Sometimes it was silk. Sometimes, astonishingly, it was one woman. In the capital of Orjubalak, archaeologists have uncovered ruins of palaces whose ceilings were painted with constellation stars flickering above banquet halls, as if the Uyghurs had bottled the night sky indoors. Imagine feasts beneath those painted heavens, musicians with lutes, courtiers in embroidered robes, warriors clinking cups of kumi, their laughter shaking the pillars, and seated in that glittering hall, a princess whose name is not widely remembered in the West, but whose gesture changed the fate of nations. The story goes like this: the Tang dynasty of China, exhausted by rebellion and invasion, desperately needed peace with the Uyghurs. Yet negotiations between kings and khagans stalled, pride clashed with pride. Then a Uyghur princess described in chronicles as serene as the moon, and wise beyond her years, entered the hall. She rose, lifted a single silk veil, and placed it gently across the table between emissaries. The hall fell silent, for in Uyghur custom, a veil was more than cloth. It symbolized protection, honor, and union. To lay it between rivals was to say, "Here lies peace, if you will take it." And they did. That night, alliances were sealed. Trade resumed. Bloodshed was postponed for decades, all because of a veil as light as breath. This was not an isolated moment. Uyghur princesses, like many women of the steppe, were often diplomats in their own right. They carried cultures in their dowry silks, horses, scriptures, even entire retinues of scholars and priests. Through them, Manichaean priests reached China. Through them, marriages tied fragile threads between courts. Their words, their silences, even the color of the veils they chose could tilt history. But history rarely records them fully. We remember the Khagans, their battles, their treaties signed in dust and blood. The princess with the veil remains more legend than name, her story slipping between silk threads. Yet the image lingers, a hall of painted stars, and a woman who understood that sometimes peace can be stronger than the sword, if only for a fleeting moment. Still, peace on the Silk Road was always precarious. Rivers shifted, alliances frayed, and empires faded as quickly as they rose. Ahead, the road curves once more into shadow, where we encounter towers that stood proud for centuries only to be swallowed when their rivers betrayed them. From the star-painted palaces of the Uyghurs, our caravan rides west into a land of water and fire. Here, between the Amu Darya River and the shifting sands of the Kai-Zukum Desert, stood the kingdom of Khwarezm. If the deserts were death, Khwarezm was defiance, a delta of life, carved into a triangle of marshes, canals, and towers that gleamed like teeth against the horizon. Picture the skyline centuries ago, citadels rising from the reeds, walls glinting with plastered clay, and watchtowers that seemed almost arrogant in their height. These were not lonely castles. They were part of a chain dozens of fortresses, known today as the desert castles of Khwarezm, dotting the steppe-like pearls cast from a broken necklace. From afar, a caravan rider might squint at them shimmering in the heat and think, surely no enemy could breach such walls. But the strength of Khwarezm was also its curse. Its lifeblood was the Amu Darya, the great river that had flowed since ancient times. Farmers coaxed wheat and barley from its banks. Merchants pulled barges along its waters, loaded with wool, wine, and salt. Kings taxed the river's gifts, swelling their coffers. For centuries, the towers held, the citadels thrived, and then the river betrayed them. The Amu Darya is fickle. It changes course like a trickster, wandering through the desert, abandoning one bed for another. When it shifted away from Khwarezm's canals, entire towns found themselves gasping for water. Fields withered, canals turned to trenches of dust. The towers, those proud fortresses, stood suddenly stranded, like ships in a desert sea. Defensible? Yes, but useless, because without water, a castle is only a coffin. Archaeologists today walk through ruins where fish bones lie in places now hundreds of kilometers from water. Imagine a fortress once bustling with guards and merchants, its halls echoing with the bark of dogs and the crack of whips. Now, silence. Only owl wings stir the dust. For a while, Khwarezm endured. Its kings fought off Persians, Arabs, and Mongols in turn. They shifted their capitals, rebuilt canals, prayed to every god they knew, but rivers write their own destinies. By the time the Mongols swept through in the 13th century, Khwarezm was already half-starved. Its towers fell, not from Mongol arrows alone, but from thirst. And yet, here's the haunting part, the towers still stand. If you fly over the Kai-Zukum Desert today, you see them crumbling bastions, square outlines etched into yellow earth. They rise from emptiness like monuments to human stubbornness, whispering, "We thought we could master rivers, we thought we could master time." Travelers along the Silk Road told ghost stories of Khwarezm. They said the towers were haunted by sentries who still kept watch, staring over empty canals. They said on certain nights you could hear the splash of phantom oars, though no river runs there anymore. The Silk Road is littered with such reminders that empires fall not always by the sword, but sometimes simply by the quiet shift of nature. Water turns, sand moves, and suddenly a kingdom is no more. And yet, amid these ruins of stone and silence, people still carried tales, shimmering with hope or warning. One of the most dazzling was the story of the night peacock, a bird said to guard the hidden treasures of forgotten kings. That tale, my weary fellow traveler, is what we shall chase next. In the markets of Samarkand, where spices stained the air and gold winked from merchants' sleeves, travelers would sometimes hush their bargaining to tell of a creature no caravan had ever captured, but every caravan longed for: the night peacock. They said its feathers were dark as indigo, yet shimmered with hidden fire, each plume tipped with eyes that glowed like emeralds in the moonlight. Its cry was neither bird nor beast, but something like the echo of bells in a cavern. To see it was to taste both fear and wonder. For the night peacock was not merely beautiful, it was a guardian. The legend begins after the fall of a forgotten king. Some say he was from Loulan, others claim Khwarezm, still others whisper of a dynasty erased even from memory. Knowing his city was doomed, the king ordered his treasures buried, coffers of jade, bolts of silk, crowns rimmed with turquoise. But he feared thieves and curses alike, so he sought the desert spirits, offering incense and gold. They gave him one gift, a guardian bird hatched from starlight and shadow, the night peacock, who would guard the treasure until the end of time. Caravans swore that on windless nights, when the dunes glistened under moonlight, they saw the night peacock gliding silently above the sands. If you followed it, you might stumble upon the glimmer of coins or the outline of a half-buried palace wall. But woe to those who reached too greedily. The bird's eyes, 100 glittering orbs, could drive men mad. Some wandered in circles until they fell, their bones joining the desert's tally. Others returned, blind, their eyes burned white by a glimpse too close. Children in caravanserais were warned, do not chase a light in the dunes. It may be the night peacock, and if it takes offense, you will vanish into its feathers forever. But of course, warnings only feed curiosity. Young traders and foolish soldiers sometimes crept out with lamps, hoping to snare the bird and claim its treasure. None ever succeeded, and yet, the tale carried something more than fear. For some storytellers said the night peacock was not a curse, but a blessing. If a caravan was pure of heart, say, a widow carrying her family's goods, or a monk bearing sacred scrolls, the bird might alight nearby, its feathers shedding sparks like fireflies, lighting the path to safety. In these softer tellings, the night peacock became a patron of the desperate, a reminder that even in the pitiless desert, beauty and kindness might still dwell. Historians, of course, wag their fingers. They mutter that the night peacock was simply inspired by the Indian peafowl, traded along the Silk Road, its feathers gleaming strange in firelight. Or perhaps by Persian miniatures depicting Simorg, the mythical bird of wisdom. And yes, that might be true, but I suspect, don't you, that the desert needs its ghosts and guardians. Otherwise, how could anyone bear to cross it? Whether curse or comfort, the night peacock lives on in whispers. Merchants painted its likeness on clay jars. Poets compared beloved's eyes to its jeweled feathers. And in the markets of Kashgar, even now, you may still find a charm of glass and bronze, shaped like a dark bird with glowing eyes. But now, let us turn from legend back to parchment and ink. For beyond stories of birds and hidden treasures, the Silk Road's greatest marvel may have been something far humbler, a road of paper and words, a chain of letters that stitched together the empires of East and West. The Silk Road is often imagined as caravans heavy with silk, jade, and spices, but perhaps its most precious cargo was thinner than a reed, lighter than a feather: letters. From the imperial capitals of Chang'an in the east to Constantinople in the west stretched a web of postal roads, relay stations, couriers, and scribes who made it possible for words to gallop faster than any caravan. Imagine the world before smartphones, before the tick of your inbox, when news could take months to arrive. And yet, on the Silk Road, there existed a network so efficient it rivaled the post of modern empires. In Han China, stone pillars marked postal stations where weary horses were swapped for fresh ones, and dispatches from the emperor sped toward frontier garrisons. Riders thundered across deserts, carrying not just orders of war, but small comforts, a poem from a scholar to his brother, a merchant's account of profits, a son's clumsy attempt to reassure his mother he was still alive. At each station, letters were logged, sealed again, and sent onward, like bottled voices moving through the sand. In Persia, the Achaemenids and later the Sasanians perfected a similar system, the Angarium, a road of riders who could deliver messages at astonishing speed. Herodotus himself once marveled at their endurance, writing of couriers who rode through snow, heat, and storm, stopping only long enough to change horses. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night. Yes, that famous phrase began on these very roads. It would later become the unofficial motto of modern postal workers, a Silk Road ghost lingering in your neighborhood mail carrier. And at the far western edge, Byzantium maintained its own relays, binding Constantinople to its far-flung provinces. By the 7th century, one could trace a chain of messengers, Chinese couriers handing to Sogdian scribes, Sogdians passing to Persian riders, Persians delivering to Byzantine officials, each link fragile, but together forming a bridge of ink across continents. It wasn't just emperors who benefited. Archaeologists in the Taklamakan Desert have unearthed wooden slips covered in handwriting personal notes from 2,000 years ago. One soldier stationed in the desert wrote home, "I have no coat. Please send one quickly. Winter here is bitter." Another begged his wife for wine and oil, his words still smudged where the ink bled into the wood grain. Suddenly, history feels less like marble statues and more like your own text messages, mundane, needy, achingly human. And then there were the letters that never arrived. In the sands near Dunhuang, entire caches of documents have been found, bundles of correspondence sealed and forgotten when wars shifted routes or when towns were abandoned. They reveal merchants promising delivery dates they surely missed, monks requesting donations, and even children's homework exercises abandoned mid-sentence. The desert preserved what bureaucracy lost. Consider, for a moment, what this meant. An empire might fall, a city might vanish, but a scrap of papyrus or silk could carry a human voice across centuries. The Silk Road was not only silk, it was memory. A postal road of empires? Yes, but also a lifeline for ordinary people whispering into history, "I was here. I lived. I loved. Please don't forget me." But not all written records are so tender. Some shimmer with controversy, with accusations and legends that still divide historians. And one such tale waits for us now in Samarkand, where whispers claim that an emperor's garden bloomed not with water, but with melted gold. Ah, Samarkand, if the Silk Road had a jewel, this city was its brightest facet, blue-tiled domes glittering like fragments of sky, bazaars humming with languages as tangled as a skein of silk. Here ruled Timur Tamerlane, to the west the conqueror who carved empires with iron and fire. Yet amid his brutality lies a story, half history, half scandal, that still teases scholars and storytellers alike. It is said that Timur loved gardens, not merely orchards for fruit or patches of herbs, but extravagant displays where rare trees from distant lands bent their boughs under foreign suns. His courtiers boasted that nightingales sang sweeter in Samarkand than anywhere else, as if the city itself compelled beauty to bloom. But the legend darkens here. Some chroniclers whispered that Timur, flushed with plunder from Delhi and Persia, ordered his gardens watered not with river water, but with melted gold and silver. Imagine it, irrigation channels gleaming with molten metal, coins hissing into liquid, pouring down carved stone gutters. Trees shimmering in reflected firelight, their roots scorched by wealth itself. A grotesque alchemy of vanity. Is it true? Historians gnash their teeth. Some argue it was metaphor, a poetic jab by rivals. Timur's greed was so great. He watered trees with gold. Others point to chronicles written by Persian historians, who recorded the claim with sly precision, as though unsure themselves whether they were gossiping or documenting. Archaeologists have found no physical proof, no charred root balls rimmed in gold, but absence of evidence, as the saying goes, is not evidence of absence. Yet the tale refuses to die. Tour guides in Samarkand today still lower their voices and say, "Here, here he poured his treasure into the dirt." Travelers carry the story westward until it reaches European ears, where it becomes a moral lesson. Wealth corrupts, power consumes, and golden rivers cannot nourish life. And isn't that the perfect paradox? That a conqueror who burned cities to the ground, who stacked skulls in towers as tall as minarets, would also be remembered as the man who tried to make paradise bloom with molten coins. For you, weary traveler, the image lingers. Violet gardens, leaves glowing copper red, and roots writhing in rivers of treasure. Whether truth or slander, it captures something real. The Silk Road was not only about trade and beauty, but about excess, about emperors who believed the world itself could be bent to their vanity. But while Timur's scandalous gardens invite skepticism and awe, the Silk Road was also shaped by ordinary lives, people far from thrones, whose choices and courage could tip the fate of cities. And in the shadows of this golden legend walks another story, that of a widow, her caravan, and how one unnoticed journey changed everything. Not every Silk Road tale belongs to kings and conquerors. Sometimes history bends beneath the quiet weight of those who were never meant to be remembered, like the widow whose story flickers faintly in scattered records, half in ledger, half in rumor. Picture her, veiled, wrapped in coarse wool, face shadowed by grief. Her husband, once a caravan master of modest renown, had died suddenly on the road, leaving debts heavier than his camel's packs. By the law of her city, she might have surrendered her goods to creditors, but she refused. Instead, she gathered her son, a handful of loyal servants, and what wealth remained: bolts of silk, jars of saffron, and one small casket of lapis lazuli, and set out to finish the journey herself. It was unheard of. A woman leading a caravan was as strange as a camel pulling a chariot of kings. Other merchants laughed, shaking their heads, certain she and her camels would vanish into the dunes. Yet night by night, mile by mile, she pressed onward. At first, her caravan was pitifully small: 3 camels, 2 donkeys, a single tent. But on the road, something curious happened. Stragglers joined her, a young man fleeing conscription, a runaway slave, a scholar to poor to buy his passage. She welcomed them all, not with promises of riches, but with fair shares of bread and water. What began as a widow's desperate gamble grew into a ragged procession. When her caravan reached Merv, the city at the edge of empire, the gates nearly closed against her. She had no formal license, no family name powerful enough to silence the guards. But the people of her caravan spoke for her, each telling their story, each swearing loyalty. The governor, amused or perhaps impressed, allowed them entry. What she sold in Merv was not just silk and lapis, but the strange unity of her company. Soon, rumors spread. The widow's caravan was fairer in its dealings than many of the great houses. She refused to cheat waits, to water down wine, to undercut rivals by treachery. Traders who once mocked her now found their wives and daughters speaking her name with respect. She had, without intending to, carved a reputation along the Silk Road, not as a queen, but as something rarer, a leader whose power grew from fairness rather than fear. One winter, when Merv faced famine, it was her warehouses, humble though they were, that released grain to the hungry. Chronicles note simply that a woman spared the city from fire. The fire was metaphorical, a riot that never happened, a rebellion starved of anger. But in truth, she altered the path of history. Her name, lost, the scribes recorded only the widow of the road. Yet her story lingers in oral traditions, a tale mothers told their daughters, that even on the harshest road, even in the shadow of kings, a woman with courage and a caravan of strays could alter the fate of thousands. And that, perhaps, is the lesson of the Silk Road. Not only the mighty left their marks, even whispers could turn cities. Even footsteps barely seen in the sand could echo for centuries. Still, the road was never safe, for while the widow carried honesty in her packs, others carried daggers in their sleeves. In the next stretch of our journey, will slip into the night courtyards of the caravanserais, where shadows whispered faster than couriers and gossip was sometimes sharper than steel. Step now inside a caravanserai, a fortress of trade, squatting square and heavy on the desert road. Its walls rise thick against sandstorms, its courtyard wide enough for 100 camels to kneel in hissing unison. The gates creak shut at dusk, iron clanging, and suddenly you are inside a world apart, half inn, half marketplace, half theater of secrets. Here, beneath lantern light, merchants unfurl their wares. Spices spill perfume into the air, fabrics unfurl in rivers of color, and the crackle of roasting meat mingles with the bray of donkeys. Camels groan in their pens, relieved of burdens, while guards sharpen their scimitars in quiet corners. But it isn't the goods that make a caravanserai precious, it's the gossip. Imagine, one rider arrives from Chang'an, bearing whispers of a new edict from the Han court. Another comes from Baghdad, boasting that the caliph now wears silks finer than any emperor in China. A third, dusty from Byzantium, insists the emperor there has gone mad or married a goat, depending on how much wine he's had. Truth, lies, no one cares, for on the Silk Road, information itself was currency, sometimes more valuable than gold. Within these walls, reputations were made or unmade. A single rumor, carried in laughter across the courtyard, could collapse a dynasty's prestige before the dynasty itself knew it was faltering. Soldiers leaned in, priests frowned, poets scribbled verses half drunk with speculation. One merchant, sipping sour wine, might declare, "The Persians prepare for war." By morning, caravans would adjust their routes, kings would ready their armies, all because of a sentence murmured in the smoke. And the irony, half the rumors were false. Or worse planted, caravanserais were not just inns. They were the internet of the medieval world. Spies nestled among traders, scribbling notes to send back to their masters. Courtesans lingered in corners, listening, their earrings catching lamplight as they traded secrets for silk. Even the storytellers, the bards strumming lutes for a coin, sometimes laced their songs with coded messages. Yet for all this intrigue, a warmth threaded through the noise. Travelers of every tongue and skin color sat shoulder to shoulder, slurping broth, chuckling at tales, swapping remedies for camel sores. In those moments, the Silk Road was less a battlefield of empires and more a campfire of humanity. Still, you could not let your guard down. For every genuine whisper, there lurked a dagger of deceit. Consider the story of a Khitan envoy who stopped at a caravanserai on his way to Persia. Over bread and wine, he heard of a planned ambush in the mountains. He rerouted his caravan, only to discover later that the warning had been planted by rivals who lighted his original path while he wasted weeks circling the desert. The caravanserai gave, and the caravanserai took away. And so, within these clay walls, truth galloped faster than any horse, but lies trotted close behind, eager to trip the unwary. From this smoky, rumor-thick courtyard, let us follow one of those whispered tales into the wide grasslands, where a people known as the Khitan built a paradox of empire. Poets by day, pillagers by night, both admired and feared across the Silk Road, out beyond the caravanserais, where the steppe unrolls in endless green waves, rode the Khitan. Nomads, fierce horsemen, masters of the bow yet also lovers of silk robes, jade cups, and Chinese verse. They were contradiction incarnate, and for a century or more they held the fate of both steppe and empire in their restless hands. By the 10th century, the Khitan founded the Liao dynasty, a state that stretched from Mongolia into northern China. Their rulers wore crowns of fur and gold, and their horses stamped impatiently in palace courtyards. And here is the paradox. The Khitan adored the very civilization they so often raided. They burned Chinese palaces, yes, but then rebuilt them for themselves. They forced Chinese officials into service, yet collected Chinese poetry and paintings with reverence. One Khitan Khan was said to carry Confucian classics in his saddlebag, tucked beside his quiver of arrows. Picture a Khitan encampment at dusk, tents vast as small cities, embroidered with patterns of clouds and deer. Fires crackled, warriors feasted on roasted lamb, the grease shining on their lips. And in a pavilion at the center, nobles reclined on silk cushions, listening to musicians pluck zithers and recite Tang verses. Imagine the scene, a conqueror wiping lamb fat from his chin while murmuring lines of Li Bai, a Chinese poet whose words floated like smoke across dynasties. The Khitan were pragmatists. They adopted Chinese bureaucracy paperwork, seals, officials in long robes, but never surrendered their nomadic pride. Their government ran on a dual system: Chinese laws for the Chinese subjects, Khitan laws for the Khitan tribes. Two courts, two languages, two identities, stitched together with uneasy thread. And yet, unease breeds brilliance. Liao tombs uncovered in Manchuria reveal murals of startling beauty. Noble women hunting with hawks, officials sitting cross-legged with scrolls, servants offering cups of fermented mare's milk. The art blends Chinese delicacy with steppe boldness, bright colors, rolling movement, faces alive with expression. In one mural, a Khitan princess gazes out with sharp eyes, her robes fluttering like storm clouds, as if daring you to underestimate her. Still, admiration for China did not tame their hunger. When Chinese dynasties faltered, the Khitan struck like falcons, burning cities, seizing tribute, parading their spoils across the grasslands. To Chinese chroniclers, they were barbarians, dangerous and crude. To their own poets, they were inheritors of heaven's mandate, rightful rulers who blended horse and brushstroke, arrow and ink. And this paradox still lingers: were the Khitan destroyers or preservers? Did they hollow out Chinese culture, or keep it alive during times of fracture? Historians argue, but the answer, like the steppe horizon, stretches endlessly both ways. One thing is certain: the Khitan lived by contrast, raiders who cherished verse, warriors who treasured porcelain, rulers who governed with one hand in the saddle and the other on a scroll. And such contradictions made them dangerous, for an enemy who can both burn your palace and quote your poets is an enemy hard to understand, harder still to defeat. But empires of paradox often collapse under their own weight. In time, the Khitan would be driven west, scattering like thistledown in the wind, leaving behind a trail of hybrid kingdoms and half-forgotten legacies. Before that exile, however, one story lingers, a tale not of armies or palaces, but of a poisoned cup in the frontier city of Bactra, a mystery that unfolded like a detective story, proving that sometimes the Silk Road was not just a highway of goods, but a stage for betrayal sharp as any dagger. Bactra modern Balkh sat at the meeting point of mountains, rivers, and roads. Caravans from India, Persia, and China all funneled through its gates, making it both a treasure chest and a tinderbox. To enter Bactra was to taste every flavor of the Silk Road: saffron perfuming the air, bronze bells jangling from mule packs, and voices clashing in 10 different tongues. Yet within this crossroads city, danger often walked closer than friendship. One story, preserved half in Persian chronicle, half in whispered folklore, tells of a murder that unfolded not with the clash of swords, but with the lift of a cup. A banquet was held in Bactra's governor's palace, its walls painted with lotus flowers, its tables set with goblets of hammered silver. Merchants reclined on cushions, diplomats preened in embroidered robes, and musicians plucked soft melodies to drown the drone of politics. In the center, the governor raised his glass, its rim catching the lantern light like a halo. He drank deeply, smiling, and moments later his lips turned blue. Panic erupted, servants scattered, merchants cursed, guards pressed hands to sword hilts. The governor gasped, clawed at his throat, and collapsed upon the rugs. Poison, but whose hand had delivered it? Here begins the detective tale of the Silk Road. Some claim the culprit was a Persian envoy, furious over tariffs that bled caravans dry. Others swore it was a Chinese merchant, cheated in tribute. A third rumor accused the governor's own brother, hungry for the seat of power. Every whisper carried weight, for in a city where 10 empires touched, each grievance was as sharp as a blade. Investigators were summoned, scribes combed through ledgers, hunting for sudden fortunes. Guards interrogated servants, prying into which hand had poured the wine. One account claims that in the panic, a silk merchant slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind only an abandoned pack horse. Later, when his baggage was searched, 2 flasks of bitter herbs were found, the kind used in frontier medicine, but deadly if boiled into wine. The merchant, of course, had vanished into the desert. Was he scapegoat or assassin? The records break here, torn between accusation and doubt. The chronicles declare sternly, justice was served, but the folktales laugh. They say the merchant was never caught, that he wandered on, joining another caravan, changing his name, sipping from another goblet in another city. For that was the Silk Road's truth, identities blurred. A man could be a merchant in one town, a spy in another, a murderer in the next. By the time rumors caught up with him, he was already gone, his footprints lost in the dunes. Yet the poison cup lingers, as metaphor, on the Silk Road. Death might not come from a bandit's blade in the desert, but from the hand offering you wine across a table. Alliances were as fragile as glass, friendships as treacherous as sweetened drink, and still caravans traveled on, because for every betrayal, there was a bargain. For every poisoned cup, another raised an honest toast. To survive, merchants learned a peculiar skill. They memorized not maps, but stories. Not coordinates, but images. A cup might kill, but a carved bone might save. Which leads us into the next secret of the road, the desert map that could be carried not in parchment, but in a single piece of carved ivory bone, its grooves teaching a merchant how to find his way by touch alone. Close your eyes. Imagine you are a caravan master, leading 30 camels across a desert where every dune looks the same. The windy races tracks within minutes, the stars are blurred by storms, and water lies hidden days away. A parchment map, useless, it tears, fades, or blows away. But what if you could carry the desert itself in your hand? Thus were born the bone maps. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of ivory and cattle bone carved with grooves, dots, and shallow-cut strange objects that at first seemed like jewelry or toys. But along the Silk Road, they were whispered of as guides, portable landscapes, tactile maps you could read with your fingers even in the dark. Picture one. A long shard of bone, smooth at the edges, etched with lines that curve like rivers, clusters of notches marking oases, circles for caravanserais, tiny arrows pointing toward passes. To the untrained, it is gibberish. To a merchant who had memorized its code, it was salvation. You could ride at night, fingers brushing the bone in your pocket, recalling the tale tied to each mark. 3 cuts mean the place of reeds water flows there in spring. The circle means the fortress with 2 gates rest, but beware the greedy governor. The map was not just tactile, it was oral. Every cut had a story, a memory passed from master to apprentice. Navigation here was not lines and latitude, it was narrative. A dune shaped like a sleeping ox, a stone that cast a shadow like a spear at noon, a ruined tower where owls nested. These images anchored the map in your mind, the bone serving only as a trigger for the tale. Think of it, the Silk Road itself was less a road than a song, learned by heart. Merchants carried not only goods, but entire libraries of remembered paths. When the bones were smooth, the maps remained alive in memory, passed down like heirlooms. In this way, the desert so vast, so indifferent was tamed by touch and story. Even so, danger lingered. What if the stories changed? What if the apprentice misremembered a cut, or a storm altered the landmark? Then the bone could betray as easily as it saved. There are tales of caravans vanishing because one line was carved too shallow, one story told too vaguely. In the end, memory was both compass and curse. Modern historians marvel at these fragments, still debating, were they truly maps, or ritual talismans? Some argue they were memory aids for merchants, Others say they were charms against evil spirits of the desert. But perhaps those are the same thing, for when you're lost beneath endless stars, is there any difference between a map and a prayer? And this, fellow traveler, leads us to another debate that flutters across chronicles, the Great Falcon controversy. For just as bone maps guided merchants, birds once guided kings, and their trade in falcons became both a lifeline and a ruin for empires. Not all treasures of the Silk Road glittered in gold or gleamed in silk. Some had feathers, some screamed at the sky, and some, astonishingly, were worth more than rubies. Enter the falcon. To the nomads of the steppe, falcons were not pets, but partners, sharp-eyed hunters, who could strike a hare from 50 paces or tear into the throat of a wild goose mid-flight. To kings and caliphs, they were status symbols, rarer and more thrilling than the finest jewel. A trained falcon, they said, could be traded for 10 camels, or even for a horse gilded in silver tack. In courts from Baghdad to Chang'an, falcons perched beside thrones, their hoods stitched with pearls, their talons capped with gold. The trade was massive. Caravans carried cages of restless birds, their wings clipped, their eyes covered to calm them. Imagine the cacophony, the grunt of camels, the creak of saddles, and the shrill cries of dozens of falcons hungry for meat. To see such a caravan was to know. Here was wealth on the wing. But controversy claws at this trade. Historians argue, did the Silk Road's obsession with falcons help empires flourish or hasten their ruin? On one hand, falcons were diplomatic currency. Envoys from Khwarezm offered them to Chinese emperors in exchange for trade privileges. The Abbasid caliphs gifted them to Viking chieftains, who carried the birds northward into icy fjords. A single falcon might seal a treaty where armies failed. Even the Mongols, those masters of the steppe, sent falcons as gifts to kings they had not yet conquered, tokens both of respect and a warning. On the other hand, the trade drained kingdoms. Capturing and training falcons required entire networks of trappers, trainers, and breeders. Some rulers poured fortunes into this pursuit, neglecting their people. There are accounts of peasants starving while falcons dined on beef, of canals crumbling while aviaries expanded. Was this magnificence or madness? The environmental toll too is debated. Overhunting of falcons, especially rare species like the gyr falcon, may have disrupted ecosystems. Desert folklore warned, if too many hunters bind the sky, the earth itself will thirst. Was this superstition or a veiled recognition of imbalance? One Persian chronicler sneered that an emir spent more on feathers than on fields. Another praised falconry as proof of divine favor. If the bird stooped from heaven into your hand, surely heaven itself approved your rule. Which was true? Both, perhaps. Even now, the question lingers, were falcons the Silk Road's strangest luxury, birds that fed pride but starved kingdoms? Or were they winged ambassadors, carrying peace between empires with every beat of their wings? No final answer has been found. The falcons are long gone, their bones dust. Yet their legacy remains perched on the edge of history, part triumph, part ruin. And so, from this debate of wings and wealth, let us turn to something more fragile yet enduring, the story of a scholar cast into exile, who saved the memory of 10 forgotten cities not with armies or treasure, but with ink. Exile is a cruel teacher. It strips a man of rank, robe, and recognition, leaving only his mind as companion. And so it was with a scholar of the Silk Road, his name blurred in chronicles, but his work luminous still, who, cast out from courtly favor, wandered into obscurity and in doing so saved memory itself. He had once served as a scribe in a great city, some say Chang'an, others whisper Samarkand, copying decrees onto silk, trimming his brush to perfection, weighing each stroke as if heaven judged. But politics is as fickle as sand. One insult to many, or one faction too strong, and he found himself accused of treachery. Banished, stripped of his position, he was ordered never to return. So, he walked the Silk Road not as envoy, but as outcast. Along the way, he saw what few scribes ever witnessed, ruins where children played among broken statues, caravanserais abandoned to bats, and towns erased so thoroughly that only wind remembered their names. And here the scholar did something extraordinary. He wrote them down, on scraps of parchment, on the backs of ledgers, even on slivers of wood. He recorded names and stories told by shepherds and widows, by wandering monks and grizzled guards. 10 cities he preserved, cities no longer found on any map. He noted their rivers, their customs, their gates. He sketched in words the markets where spices once gleamed and the towers where flags once cracked against the sky. His book was no grand epic. It was more like a patchwork diary, humble and almost desperate. At times he slipped into poetry, at times into meticulous lists. The city of Kadam had 3 wells. The water sweet in the first, brackish in the second, and cursed in the third. Another entry. In Omar, the walls were painted with suns. Even in ruins, the red pigment clings. When he finally died in obscurity, his book passed to a monk, who tucked it into a monastery library in Dunhuang. Centuries later, when the hidden library cave was opened, the manuscript was discovered weathered, stained, but intact. And in it, 10 names that would otherwise have been swallowed forever. Historians now debate whether those cities ever truly existed, or whether exile had bent the scholar's mind into weaving half-imagined places from rumor. Some archaeologists claim to have found traces matching his descriptions, shards of pottery, outlines of walls. Others shake their heads, calling it all a dream. But perhaps that is beside the point. The Silk Road was built as much on memory and story as on stone. The exiled scholar's book reminds us that writing itself can be an act of defiance, that to record is to resist forgetting. His 10 cities, whether real, half-real, or invented, still breathe because one lonely man, cast out from power, refused to let them die in silence, and so his ink echoes louder than the swords of the generals who destroyed those places. His exile became his gift to us, a map not of geography, but of remembrance. From this fragile book, let us follow one last great caravan laden not with memory, but with finality. A procession that marked the twilight of forgotten empires, a journey into betrayal, storm, and silence. The Silk Road had always been a stage for beginnings, fresh caravans, new alliances, the hum of markets rising like dawn. But it also bore witness to endings, and one of those endings, half history and half legend, was remembered as the last caravan of the old empires. It began with grandeur, a line of 200 camels, their backs bending beneath loads of silk, porcelain, saffron, pearls, manuscripts, even cages of restless falcons. Merchants boasted that this caravan would bring more wealth than any before. Guards marched beside them with spears glinting in the sun. A nobleman, cloaked in brocade, rode at the head, proclaiming this was not just trade, it was resurrection. With these profits, he swore, his fading kingdom would rebuild palaces, refill coffers, outlast even the Mongols who pressed against its borders. But the desert cares nothing for oaths. The caravan set out across the Taklamakan under skies too still, too bright. Travelers muttered, when the desert sleeps so quiet, a storm is near. Days later, it struck wine shrieking like 1,000 demons, sand slashing skin raw, camels dropping to their knees in terror. Men shouted, voices torn away by the gale. Half blind, the caravan stumbled onward, abandoning packs, abandoning comrades. When the storm broke, dozens were missing, worse awaited. In the aftermath, when exhaustion dulled vigilance, betrayal slithered in. Some guards, seeing fortune in the chaos, turned on their masters. They slit open bales of silk, stuffed jewels into their robes, fled with horses into the night. The nobleman awoke to find his retinue halved, his trust gutted as surely as his coffers. And still, he pushed onward. The survivors, hollow-eyed, limped into the shadow of mountains where snow glistened cruelly white. There, at the high pass, came the final blow. An ambush. Bandits or perhaps soldiers of a rival empire, The chronicles disagree descended from the cliffs like wolves. The nobleman fought, striking until his sword snapped. Some say he died there, buried beneath snow and silence. Others whisper he escaped, a ragged figure wandering eastward, clutching a single scroll as his only possession. What became of that caravan? Its treasure was scattered, pearls ground into the sand, manuscripts dissolving in snowmelt, silks unraveling in the wind. Of the kingdom that sent it forth, little remains but a line or two in chronicles, a smudge of memory. No rescuers came, no allies wept. The empires of the Silk Road had already begun to fade, one by one, into silence. And so the final caravan became more than a tale of trade. It became a parable, of greed undone by storm, of loyalty betrayed by hunger, of glory devoured by time. For centuries afterward, travelers crossing that pass would claim they heard the echoes camel bells faint in the distance, voices muttering bargains in the wind, the shimmer of silk rippling across snow where no silk should be. Perhaps it was only imagination, or perhaps the Silk Road itself remembers what we forget, replaying its tragedies in the howl of storms. But history does not end in storms alone, for even as these empires crumbled, their descendants still stir tea in modern bazaars, still sing songs in marketplaces where trade has never truly ceased. And so we turn, before our journey's close, to the living echoes, the children of forgotten kingdoms laughing among bolts of cloth and crates of oranges. Step now with me into a marketplace not of the past, but of the present. The caravanserais may be ruins, their walls broken, but the bazaars that once pulsed at their gates still beat like living hearts. Walk through Samarkand's Registan Square at dawn, or the Grand Bazaar of Kashgar on a Friday afternoon, and you will hear it, the same chorus that once rang down the Silk Road. Spices still shout their perfumes into the air: cumin, cardamom, dried rose petals. Vendors slap copper pots with the flat of their hands, ringing out metallic invitations. Silks shimmer on racks, their folds catching light like water. Laughter bubbles up as traders banter, the jokes often older than the buildings themselves. The coins may be different, the banknotes printed by new governments, but the ritual of barter offer, counter offer, sly grin, final clap of hands remains unchanged. Look closer, and you glimpse the ghosts of forgotten empires. A rug pattern in Bukhara still bears motifs that once adorned Khwarezm's vanished towers' geometric suns, river symbols woven in crimson thread. A melody played on a dombra in a Kyrgyz market echoes scales first strummed in Kushan temples. Even the bread, that flat, golden naan baked against clay walls, carries whispers of recipes needed in Sogdian kitchens 1,000 years ago, and the people descendants without perhaps even knowing it. A merchant in Samarkand traces his family back 10 generations of silk sellers, though he cannot name the empire his ancestors once served. A Uyghur grandmother selling raisins in Kashgar hums lullabies that preserve words older than her lineage. Children dart between stalls, shouting in Russian, Uzbek, Uyghur, Mandarin, a polyphony of tongues, as if the Sogdians themselves had returned. The legacy of forgotten empires survives, not in monuments, but in gestures, the way a trader folds his hands politely after a bargain, the way tea is poured 3 times to honor guest, host, and journey, the way a grandmother presses an apricot into your palm for sweetness on your road. And isn't that, perhaps, the truest survival? Empires crumbled, rivers shifted, palaces drowned in sand, but the spirit of trade, of exchange, of connection, still flourishes in every laugh that echoes under bazaar domes. These are the embers of forgotten kingdoms, glowing quietly in clay ovens, shimmering in silk threads, tasting of honey and dust. But the Silk Road is never only one story. Its past ends in ruins. Yes, and its present thrives in markets. Yet its future, that, dear traveler, lies open. Will the road be remembered as a graveyard of empires, or as an eternal thread binding peoples together? That question waits in our final section, where the lantern light flickers and we must choose how the story ends. The lanterns burn low now, their flames bowing like weary travelers. Our road has stretched from the deserts of Loulan to the towers of Khwarezm, from the painted halls of Uyghur princesses to the bazaars where laughter still lingers. We have walked beside widows and kings, monks and spies, falcons and phantom birds. And yet, as the last dune rises before us, one question remains. What truly became of the Silk Road's hidden empires? One ending whispers of loss, the sands won. Rivers betrayed their cities, storms devoured their caravans, conquerors burned their palaces. Saudia became a footnote, Loulan a corpse, Khwarezm a grave of towers. Even the Kushans, who dreamed in marble and gold, crumbled into dust, forgotten, silent, their names spoken now only by historians, or murmured by insomniacs drifting to sleep with stories like this one. In this ending, the Silk Road is a graveyard, its lanterns extinguished, its empires nothing more than bones beneath the dunes. But another ending flickers brighter, more defiant. What if the Silk Road never truly died? Its empires may have fallen, but their spirits live on, in the rugs of Samarkand, in the naan of Kashgar, in the laughter of merchants haggling as their ancestors once did. Every time a child in Central Asia learns two languages at once, every time a trader slaps a hand in agreement, every time a traveler follows an old story to find an oasis there, the Silk Road breathes again. The empires did not vanish. They changed form, slipping into bloodlines, into customs, into stories told beneath painted stars. So, which ending do you choose, traveler? The silence of the grave, or the persistence of the spirit? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the Silk Road is like the wine bride herself, sometimes guiding us to safety, sometimes vanishing into the storm, but always present, flickering at the edges of our vision. Look to the desert tonight. If the moon hangs low and the air is still, you might just glimpse them, the silhouettes of riders cresting the dunes, their lanterns swaying, their camels breathing clouds into the night. Forgotten kings, nameless widows, merchants with bone maps, scholars clutching books, all still traveling, endlessly, under desert moons. And maybe, just maybe, you are one of them now. The fire is nearly out, its glow softening into embers, its smoke curling gently into the cool air. Let the noise of the journey fade. The storms, the betrayals, the painted halls and haunted towers, they all slip now into the distance, like camel tracks erased by dawn winds. You are no longer in the marketplace, no longer in the desert. You are lying here, in your own quiet space, the story receding into a whisper. Breathe with me. In, out, slowly, as though the Silk Road itself has uncoiled across your chest and is settling into stillness. The faces we met, Ogdian merchants, Loulan queens, Uyghur princesses, exiled scholars, are all at rest now. They linger only as echoes, shadows painted across the inside of your eyelids. The clamor of bazaars, the thunder of hooves, the shriek of storms, they have softened into something gentler. Now they are only background hum, like the low purr of night itself. Feel your body sinking, as though into sand that holds you kindly. The desert is no longer hostile. It is a cradle, vast and calm. The stars above are steady, not sharp but softened, their light pooling like warm water around you. And if your mind wanders still, let it follow the caravan lanterns bobbing away, each step carrying them farther until they are specks of light dissolving into the horizon. Soon they are gone, only the night remains, only the quiet. Rest now, the journey is complete, and the road will keep. Close your eyes, gentle traveler. The Silk Road will still be here tomorrow, waiting for you in the folds of memory, in the hush of dreams. Sleep well.